Good morning, everybody. I don't know any other way to get started other than to be loud, so good morning. It's good to see you this morning. Maybe it's the weather, maybe it's cheering on my team yesterday, but my voice isn't quite there, so I ask you to be patient with me. We're going to begin our Bible class this morning. I'm so used to somebody else getting up here and getting us started that I'm actually a few minutes behind. So if you were with us on Wednesday, which I would presume that not everyone was, but most of you were, then you know we began to have a short discussion about a problem that is often faced, that Christians often are confronted with, and that is more so from the critics of Christianity and the critics of those who believe in God, and that is the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. We began to have that discussion on Wednesday, and as often the case, I didn't get through my material. I said, we'll have to pick this up another time. And Lee, being the opportunistic man he is, said, hey, I've got something for you. We need a teacher on Sunday morning. Do you want to finish it? And obviously, that was killing two birds with one stone, so I immediately said, yeah, that makes the most sense, so we can start our Luke study on time on Wednesdays. If you haven't developed the habit of being here with us on Wednesdays for Bible study, we have a lot of great teachers that teach both Sunday and Wednesday. I'll be starting in two Wednesdays from now a study on the book of Luke. I invite you to come and be with us for that study, and I think it'll be beneficial. The main purpose of that study is for us to more intimately get to know Jesus and fall in love with Jesus and establish a closer relationship with Him. And I know no better way of doing that than just reading what the Bible reveals about Jesus from His birth to His adolescence to His earthly ministry to His death, burial, and resurrection. So come and join us in that study. Just a quick recap of what we did cover on Wednesday. We presented this tradition. It has often been asked, what is the strongest argument you as an atheist have against God? Anthony Flew was asked that question, an atheist of a few decades ago. Also, Richard Dawkins was asked on more than one occasion. I've heard him ask, what's the strongest argument you have against the existence of God? And I've heard him say on more than one occasion, it is the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And so the argument goes like this, and I've seen it presented from a college professor kind of in this way. They will ask the class and say, do you believe in God? Raise your hand, and a portion of the class raises their hand. And in the example that I'm thinking of, the professor said, well, I believe that if you're a intelligent-minded individual, you're rational, then by the end of this 18-week course, you're not going to have good reason to believe in God anymore. So go ahead and get used to that idea. He'll say that on day one, at least the example that I'm thinking of. And he will go on to say, those of you who raised your hand, I'm assuming that you believe in the God of the Bible. Most people say yes. And he says, okay, here's a question. The God that you believe in, is He all-powerful? And what is our answer when we look to the Bible? The answer is yes, He's all-powerful. And then they will ask, well, the God you believe in, is He not only all-powerful, but would you say He is a God of love? Yes, He is a God of love. Actually, John says in his epistle that God is love. So yes, God is all-powerful, and yes, God is love. And then they will ask the third question, that is there evil in this world? Yes. Along with that, is there suffering in this world? Do even good people experience hardships and pain? And the answer, if we're being honest, is what? Yes. That certainly happens. The Bible does not shy away from this. If you read the Old Testament stories, you see good, godly individuals going through horrific times. Just challenging circumstances. I think of Joseph, for instance, who was just simply trying to be an obedient son and a follower of God, and he is betrayed by his brothers. They wanted to kill him. They throw him in a pit. He's sold into slavery. He is wrongfully accused. He's thrown into prison. He's forgotten, so on and so forth. We know the story ends well, though. But in the moment, we see nothing but suffering one after another. And this college professor, whoever is presenting this traditional atheistic argument, will then go on to say, well, okay, since there is evil, pain, and suffering in this world, that is a reality. If your God really is who He says He is, if He is even real, if He's all-powerful, why doesn't He stop it? Or maybe he's all powerful, but maybe he doesn't stop it because he just doesn't care about you or anyone. If he's really loving like you say he is, then why doesn't he do something about it? The fact that there is evil, pain, and suffering, the atheist would argue, means that either your God is not all powerful, or it means your God is not loving the way you say he is, or three, it may even mean that your God doesn't even exist at all. And I lay it out that way as bluntly as that is because that's the way it's presented to us. That's the way it can be presented even in an academic class or in any setting to our young people. And that's challenging because it seems like it makes logical sense. But with most things that are of this importance, it is more nuanced than that. And so I would argue that what you just heard is less of a rational argument and it's more of an emotional argument. We'll explain what we mean by that. I don't want to spend all of our time this morning recapping what we covered Wednesday, so let me hit it in some bullet points. Number one, it needs to be stated that this does not disprove God, and what we're trying to do in this lesson is show why these arguments do not disprove God. It's worth noting that, yes, suffering happens in our life. Think of the suffering that can happen in our life. We use an example of a mother and a baby in a car seat who get hit head on by a drunk driver. And when that wreck takes place, the mother dies, the infant dies, leaving that family in mourning. And those tragedies, as awful as it is, do things like that happen in this life? Yes, they do. Actually, I've known several stories where that exact thing has happened. And so, yes, that is suffering that happens. Something that we do in the church and outside the church that I think is a mistake, that is to blame God for things that God should not be blamed for. Someone may shake the fist at God and say, God, why did you take her from me? Why did you take my family from me? Somebody may look at that and say, well, that's an example of God just taking them from us, as though God is to blame. At the end of the day, who was it that chose to drink? Who was it that chose to get intoxicated and get behind the wheel of a car and drive 60 miles an hour down a back road? Who was it that made a series of choices that led to that car crash that evening that resulted in the death of a mother and a baby? Did God make those choices or did someone else make those choices? That's the question. And the answer is what? That drunk driver made those choices, right? And so in that particular example, the suffering that had ripple effects, it made the mother and child suffer. Maybe there was a father, maybe there were parents or grandparents, there were siblings, there were friends, there were community around those people. They all would suffer as a result of the choice of someone else, the negligent choice of someone else. And certainly we can see when someone is murdered or raped or kidnapped or any other horrible thing that we can think of in this life, it is the result of choices that someone else has made. So question, do my choices impact my life? Yes or no? Yes. Do my choices impact the lives of others? Yes, and that's powerful. In the beginning, when God created all of creation, He created man and woman in His own image. And the very first blessing that He gave man and woman was to have the freedom of choice. And here's what we discussed on Wednesday in a nutshell. It is that the nuance of our freedom of choice in this discussion is paramount in answering this question, because the atheistic argument leaves the impression that God does not have to give us a choice. That God could wipe away every hardship, can wipe away every evil, can wipe away every bad decision we make. And therefore, it's God's fault that there's evil, pain, and suffering. But I'm suggesting to you, none of that is God's fault. It's a consequence of choices that we make. We have the freedom of choice. And I can choose to serve God, to honor God. And I can choose to dishonor God by hurting others. And those choices have consequences that are attached to them. And so that's kind of what we discussed on Wednesday. Some of the suffering that exists in this world are the consequence of my own foolish choices. Like I said, if I drink a 12-pack of soda every day for the next 10 years and I end up with a report from my doctor that I've got type 2 diabetes, whose fault is that? God's or mine? That's my fault, right? If the drunk driver, if the example we just gave, that's the poor choices of others. I even would add this nuance that there are people who suffer from from cancer and other type of diseases because they were exposed to asbestos, working class men of years gone by, for instance, or those with black lung who worked in the coal mines. This was not their choice. It was not necessarily the choice of others surrounding them, their co-workers, but it was the choice of past generations that left them with the negative health report that they have now. And so choices have to be factored in. Now, why? Here's a question. Why does God give us the freedom of choice? Couldn't He have just programmed us to be robots? He could have. But what would that lead to? That's the question, right? If God just programmed all of us to be perfectly behaved, well-behaved robots where we never did anything wrong and we never chose to go against His will, what would be the result of that? Well, the result of that would simply be that we would not have a genuine relationship with God. What does it take to have a genuine relationship? Can a man say, you know what, I'm ready to get married. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to find a woman to be my wife. Well, she doesn't want to be, but whether she wants to or not, she's going to be my wife. Is that a legitimate relationship? No, it isn't. A legitimate relationship is where man and woman choose to want to be together and they mutually consent to comply with the laws of the land and the law of God, and they are bound together by God. It isn't a real relationship unless he chooses her and she chooses him. And I would even add, it's not even real love unless both parties have a choice in the matter. If God says, I'm going to program you to be a robot, and you're going to do everything that my desire and will is, but your choice means absolutely nothing. Actually, you have no choice. There is no relationship then, and there is no love. Because genuine love only happens when we have a choice. And so why did God create us? He created us because He's a God of love, and a God of love wants to love more and more and more people, and He wants to be loved back. I suspect God created us for a similar reason that we parents decided to have children. We had so much love to give away, we wanted to share it. And the idea of building a mutually beneficial relationship where that love is reciprocated once they get to a certain stage of life. And so the idea here is that when God gave us the freedom of choice, He gave us the opportunity for a legitimate relationship with Him. He gave us the opportunity to have a legitimately loving relationship with Him. But understand, with that freedom of choice come consequences, right? That's what we're talking about. Sometimes I use that choice, that freedom of choice that God has given me, to help the needy. And sometimes I may use it to speak or act in such a way that hurts somebody else. And so for that reason, that is where evil, pain, and suffering comes from. Now, does that account for every act of evil, pain, and suffering? No, I wouldn't think so. Because there are things that seem to be outside of our realm of choice making in the here and now. What do you do about the hurricanes, right? What do you do about the floods? What do you do about the tornadoes? What do you do about the tsunamis? And you can go down the list. What do you do about the person who falls off the side of a cliff to their death? And you may say it's the negligence, and it could be somewhat related to their choice, but a few things need to be taken into account. One is we have the laws of nature as God intended them, just as God gave us the freedom of choice, and with that freedom of choice, there's the benefit of having a loving, genuine relationship with God, and there's the possibility of sinning and causing hurt. And when the laws of nature are set up, there's the possibility of them working harmoniously to keep us in an orderly environment, and there's the possibility for that to go awry. We used the example on Wednesday night, how that gravity works really well. I mean, because of gravity, we're not floating right now. Because of gravity, we have stability right now. But if we're running in the woods and fall off the side of a cliff, in that instance, does gravity work in our favor? No. We plummet to our death. And here's a deeper discussion, and I'm just laying it out there as brutally honest as it might be presented outside of these walls. It's an emotional argument because the atheist will say, come with me, and we talked about this with someone right after service on Wednesday. The atheist, if they really want to be compelling, they'll say, come with me to the children's cancer wing at the local hospital. And look at these young kids who are suffering in the way that they are. Room after room after room, you see kids suffering with horrible diseases. And here's the point. They will say, well, look what your God has done, or look at what your God is allowing. Who has made the decision to cause them to suffer that way? To our knowledge, there's nothing that no choice that they made, no choice that their parents made. It's a consequence of living in an evil, corrupt realm, and that is planet Earth. And so, that's kind of what we discussed on Wednesday. But let me put it this way before we move on from this point and move into new material. And that is that when God created Adam and Eve on day 6, and He created everything with it, God looked back on all of creation, and what did God say about His own creation? Do you remember? He said, "Behold, it is very good." He said on day 1, it is good. Day 2, it is good. 3, 4, 5, 6, it is good. At the end of all of that, He looks back and says, "Behold, it is very good." Now, when God uses the word good, He's not using it in the way that we often use it. That was some good food. No, He's using it. You remember when someone calls Jesus good teacher, He says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God." When God uses the word good, He means in the complete and absolute sense, in the good in only the way that God can be good. And so understand, when God made human beings, He made them perfect. He made Adam and Eve perfect in His image. And the same can be said of their environment, the garden, the trees, the plants, the birds, the animals, the scientific processes that give us the order in this universe. He made everything just as He intended, and it was good. It was perfect in every way. Is everything good and perfect in every way right now? Is any human being perfect? Is this globe in which we live in, planet Earth, is it perfect? No, it is not. It is full of disease. It is full of natural disasters. It is full of all kinds of hardships. What do we contribute? What do we attribute to the downfall of man and creation? Why is everything now corrupt? What would be the biblical answer to that? Sin. Sin. And so, no, I cannot say with a straight face and honesty that if we see the most absurd suffering of some people in this life, that it's because they or their parents or someone around them made a sinful choice or made a choice that led to that suffering. But we look far enough back in the past, and we see that Eve and then Adam made a choice, and did Eve's choice and did Adam's choice to take of that forbidden fruit and eat of that fruit, thus committing sin, ushering in an error in which man would be corrupt and all creation would be corrupt. Did their choice impact every generation of people from there until now? Has that choice done that? Yes. So I say all of that just to say that, number one, the evil, pain, and suffering cannot be blamed on God. It's blamed on the choices of myself, the choices of others, the choices of those of past generations. And though we do not, as Calvinism alleges, inherit the sin of our ancestors, as some would allege, that is certainly not the case. Do we still face the consequences of past generations' choices? Yes, we do. And so I think just to back up and look at it from a bird's eye view to understand the importance of the freedom of choice in all of this has to be the foundation on which everything else is laid. And I say all of that to move on to new material this morning and say that raising the problem of evil, pain, and suffering from the critic trying to disprove God, that actually helps us creationists more than it hurts us. And the reason I say that is when the atheist says, look at the reality of evil, what are they admitting to? They're admitting that there is evil, right? Now, to admit that it has been stated the toughest argument for Christians to answer is the argument of evil, pain, and suffering. It has also been stated that the absolute best argument for Christians to use to prove God is the argument of morality. There is an objective standard of right and wrong. There are things that are always right and things that are always wrong, and it's objective. And that reality, when the atheist says there is evil in the world, they're admitting to a moral standard. And I would suggest to you that when we admit to a moral standard, we have, without realizing or not, admitted to the existence of a moral creator. And so that's the direction that we want to take the study at this point. Here is what I mean by that. Evil and morality cannot exist unless there is morality. That's obvious. The atheist has two options. Number one, either there is no morality at all. That's option number one. If the atheist says, oh, wait a minute, never mind, I changed my mind. There actually isn't anything that is right or wrong. There is no morality. Then what does that do with their argument of evil, pain, and suffering? It throws it out the window, because now they have to backtrack and say there actually isn't anything that is evil or wrong after all. That's option number one. Or option number two is that they would say that morality is subjective and it is only a human construct, and it's based on whatever society dictates. Now, you know where we're going with this. Let's run with that idea. And so if the atheist admits that there is an objective moral standard, then there has to be a God. We'll get back to that in a moment. They understand that, so I don't know of a true atheist who says that. They either say, well, there actually isn't anything right or wrong. And I've talked to atheists personally who understand the logical conclusion of their positions, and they know they have to say there is no morality. And I've asked an atheist these questions. Is it morally wrong to kidnap someone? No. Answer straight to the face, no. Is it morally wrong to murder someone or to rape someone or to torture someone? They said no to all of those questions. Now that's absurd, isn't it? That's crazy to think that someone would admit that, but I think he admitted that because he understood he had to be honest with his position. The other argument, or the other position they could take, is that it's based on society. They would say then, oh, that which is right is only right because that particular society, those people in that region at that time have mutually consented that these things in this category are good and these things are bad. Historically, without even needing to leave the 20th century, why does that logic not work? We had a society in World War II. There in Germany, the Nazis, they had accepted that there were certain people that were not worth having life allowed in them, and they tortured them, and they had concentration camps and gas chambers, and the numbers vary, but there's millions upon millions of people who were tortured and killed during this time. This was the very question that one of our preachers within the body of Christ, Brother Warren, was it in the 70s when he entered into a debate with a prominent atheist of his day from the UK. And as they were debating the existence of God, he asked Mr. Flew, he said, where does morality come from? And he says, well, it's based on society. It's subjective. It's whatever the people of that day and age have decided. And then Brother Warren said, well, what do you make of Nazi Germany and the killing of Jews and the concentration camps and all of that? And he says, it's wrong. And then Mr. Warren gets back up there and says, may I ask you by what standard all of that was wrong? And here's what the atheist Mr. Flew said. He said, it's wrong based on a higher standard of morality. Now, did you catch it? You only have three options. Either there is objective standard of morality that comes from a moral creator that admits the existence of God, or two, there is no morality, or three, it's based on society. He admitted that what happened in Nazi Germany was wrong. He then admitted that even though Nazi Germany said it was okay, it was still wrong based on a higher standard of morality. And you know what happened? He was the most prominent atheist of his day. On his deathbed, he expressed faith in God. And he attributed that faith in God to that single point in particular. He said, I could not get that question out of my mind because I knew that I had a choice. I either had to admit what the Nazis did in World War II was perfectly fine, or I had to admit that there is a God. He was smart enough, rational enough, and honest enough to follow the evidence where it led. And so the idea of presenting that there is evil in the world, that presents more of a problem for the atheistic person than it does the Christian, because the Christian has an entire Bible that shows God gave freedom of choice, and even good people use that freedom of choice oftentimes to do great harm and create chaos and commit sin and create hurt and suffering in this world. Doesn't make it right. But we have that freedom of choice so that we can have a legitimate, loving relationship with God. Without choice, you can have neither of those. And so that is an example that we give there. that leaves only one logical option, that is, that there is a higher standard of morality that is objective and universal despite time and location. In other words, murder is always wrong. Rape is always wrong. The mistreatment of the innocent is always wrong. That's not what Darwinian evolution teaches, right? What does Darwinian evolution teach? The survival of the fittest. Whoever can survive, that's the only standard of right and wrong. Well, no, actually, the Bible says in Psalm 119, verse 89, David writes, "Forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven." Think about that. It isn't based on location or people or time. It is based on an everlasting truth that is settled in heaven. True morality is given from God through His Word. The Christian worldview says right will always be right, wrong will always be wrong. Even when the world is falling apart and going mad, right will still be right and wrong will still be wrong. That is what we call objective morality. And if morality is not based on human beings and social constructs, then it must be given to us by our Creator. There is no other logical choice there. There is actually some benefit to suffering that I think is worth considering. And this is hard to hear if we're in the midst of suffering, right? It's hard to hear when someone we love is in the midst of suffering. But I think practically we know that suffering, we want to make it though it's just, there's no benefit at all to it, but there is benefit to suffering. It's a warning and a deterrent. You know, an example of this might be if I'm working in the kitchen and I left a stove eye on, and I'm not paying attention and I lay my hand on the stove eye, and if that stove eye is really as hot as it can be, what am I going to feel? Such an intense heat, some discomfort, and what am I going to naturally do with my hand without even needing to give it a second of thought? What is my hand going to do? Pull back, right? That small degree of pain that I may have experienced, it had a benefit, and that benefit was, it was a deterrent. It actually led me to safety. Another example of this, if I'm having intense chest pain, and we're driving down the road and I have such intense chest pain that I've never felt before, and my wife says to me, "Hey, you need to go to the hospital," and I immediately take the road leading to the emergency room. I get out, go in, and they say, it's a good thing that you're here because another 10 minutes you would be dead. Did that chest pain save me? Yeah. Did it have any benefit for me? Yes. And we understand that pain and suffering has a degree of benefit. You know, turn with me to a few Bible passages along these lines. In Romans 5 and verse number 3. Romans 5 and verse number 3. Here the Bible shows us something that I think is important on a practical level. Romans 5 and verse 3. He's talking about going through troubling times. And in Romans 5 and verse 3 he says, "And not only that, but we also glory in" what? What's your Bible say? Tribulations. Knowing that tribulation actually has benefit. Why? Because it produces perseverance. And by developing perseverance, we actually develop a godly character, and character actually gives us hope. He says, verse number 5, let's end it right there for just a moment. Go with me to James chapter 1. You know where I'm going. In James 1 and verse number 2, just understand while we're turning to James that Paul said in Romans that tribulations bring the benefit of building perseverance and godly character within us. We don't want to hear that when we're going through trials, but if we understand that beforehand, we can be equipped in the midst of our trials with that knowledge and information. In James 1 and verse 2, he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when, not if, but when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." So going through hard times of various kinds actually builds patient endurance within us. And so suffering can be a deterrent. It can be a warning, getting our attention. Suffering also builds character that, think of the tree that has outlasted a few storms. With each storm, its roots grow deeper. And the storm that it endures, the roots grow deeper, enabling it to handle stronger winds in the next storm. And then the next storm comes around and challenges it and feels at times it's almost going to be knocked over, but the roots grow even deeper, making it stronger for the next challenge. Every trial we go through is an opportunity to be able to deal with greater trials ahead. Was Jesus exempt from going through hard times? No. He shows us how to go through hard times. And if being in ministry has taught me anything, and that is, it's not always that easy to grow old. I've seen so many of my beloved brothers and sisters in Christ who have health problems and issues that come up later in life. They had been preparing for those challenges all of their life with every difficulty they had overcome and every trial that they had faced. It had built their character to overcome that. And that leads us to another point. Go with me to Psalm 119, verse 67. Psalm 119, verse 67. Covering this rather quickly, actually, this material that I'm talking about here, I've taught in a multiple week Bible study before, so I understand that I can be a little long-winded if we're not careful. In Psalm 119, notice verse 67 in your Bibles, and he tells us another benefit to suffering. In verse 67 he says, David writes, "Before I was afflicted, God, I actually went astray. But now," what is implied, now that I have been afflicted with hard times, now I keep your word. Do you see that? And so what David is saying is sometimes when life just goes as smooth as can be, when everything is going well, there's all kinds of distractions that keep us from focusing on the spiritual and the heavenly. He says, but when I hit that dead end, when I get the trial or the suffering, when it just hits me strong, it wakes me up, it jars me, it gets my attention, and I think to myself, wait a minute, I've really been on autopilot. I've not been thinking spiritually like I should. In other words, suffering can be a deterrent from going down the sinful path and get us back on the right path. At least David had that experience. And I would just notice that suffering, and this is the biggest one for me, suffering in this life, one of the biggest benefits that I've noticed up until this point is it gives me a longing for heaven. Have you ever cried? Have you ever suffered? Have you ever lost a loved one in death? Have you ever felt heartbroken? I felt all those things, and you have as well. And because my life has been negatively impacted by those things, when I read in the last part of Revelation that in heaven there will be no more pain, in heaven there will be no more tears, in heaven there will be no more death, when I read those things, it actually gives me a deep and intense longing for a day when I'm not held back by any of these things. The point being is that suffering reminds me that there are better days ahead. If this life were a perpetual walk in the park with no hardships and pleasure every day and just comfort every day, I just don't know if I'd be that excited to go to heaven because I've got everything I need right now. But no, the Bible tells us the benefits of suffering is that it builds my Christian character, it gives me a longing for heaven, it is a deterrent from a sinful path and gets me back on track, and you can keep going down that line of reasoning. Because of time, I'll just say, remember Job, and I often think of this. We want to know why. Why, God, did I go through that? Why did my wife, this is not reality, but people have this experience. Why did my wife get cancer? Why did my kid pass away? Why did I lose my job? Why did the family farm get taken? Why this? Why that? And I understand as a human being wanting to know the specific purpose in all of our hardships and suffering. But I'm reminded of Job. You know, Job, if you read the book of Job, it's an easy read, actually, in my opinion. It kind of flies by. And Job suffers a great deal. You don't need me to recount that for you, but he suffers a great deal. And what's interesting is the Bible tells us that Job, this is a side point that I find interesting, Job lost earthly possessions. He lost livestock. Go and look at everything that Job lost. He lost sheep and oxen and camel. And then go and look what he lost in other areas. And it says all of this that he lost, at the end of the story, every single thing that Job lost, he got twice that back. Did you notice that? Did you notice that when you read it? But there's one thing that Job lost that he did not get back double fold. What was that? That was his children. He actually got the same number of children back. And to me, the significance of that is you're not going to be living in eternity in heaven with your camels. You're not going to be living in eternity in heaven with your barns. But your children who passed on in that first period of suffering, you will be with them in heaven again. But God gave him that many more children. His children actually did double because human beings live on forever, right? Here's the point, though. At the end of that story, Job wanted to know why. Why, God? Why me? Why suffer like this? And we may not think it's an appropriate response, but do you remember how God responds to Job at the end of the book of Job? He doesn't respond by answering all of Job's questions about why he's suffering. He demonstrates just how great and powerful and much more knowledgeable he is than Job. And he says, Job, you have nothing on me. Don't worry about the why. Just endure. That's what he tells him. And that may sound cold to us, but that's what God tells him. It isn't the why that is important. It is the enduring of those hardships that are important. Let me give you two passages. I have had low moments at times in my past for whatever reason and for whatever purpose. Let me end right here by giving you two passages that have dramatically pulled me out of a dark hole, that literally have changed my entire mindset and direction. One of those is Romans 8 and verse 18. Read that with me, please. Romans 8 and verse 18. And I wish I had more time, but of course I understand the time we have. So let me just say that this can be a deeper discussion, but the main points before we leave with these two passages is understand when we're considering the questions of evil, pain, and suffering and the existence of God, don't forget to account for our freedom of choice, number one, and don't forget to account for the atheist admission of morality. Those two subjects there create a whole new arena in which we can entertain questions and information. In Romans 8 and verse 18, Paul says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." I mean, who is writing those words? Paul, the one who was shipwrecked, the one who was beaten, the one who was stoned to death. Who is writing that? The one who was placed in prison for what he preached. A man who suffered greatly in this life. And Paul says that I know enough at this point to know that everything I have suffered here in this life, it is not even worthy of being compared to the glory that awaits me in heaven. I think that's helpful. Second passage, and then to end the class, will be 2 Corinthians 4 and verse number 17. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 17. He says, 2 Corinthians 4:17, for our light affliction. Again, Paul is writing this. The one who had suffered like nobody else I read in the New Testament. And he is saying that he has a light affliction, which is but for a moment, and it is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Now, two things that Paul says. Even the most severe persecution and hardships I can imagine, Paul says, in light of all of my existence, they are light, they are little. But he tells me something here that I need to be reminded of. When I feel like all hope is lost, I need to be reminded, verse 17, that it's only for a moment. I talked to a person who was on the verge of suicide once. This was after the fact. And they told me, they said, TJ, I'm telling you, I would have committed suicide, and to this day, I'm surprised that I didn't. And I said, what kept you from committing suicide? And he said, when I was a kid, I used to like to go to the ocean. And he said, I would sit at that ocean and I would just watch the ocean. I would watch the waves. And he said, the moment that I was about to pull the trigger, he said, that I thought about my childhood being at the ocean and watching the waves. And he says, TJ, here's what I thought. He said, a wave would come in, and sure enough, it would go back out. The wave would come in, and sure enough, it would go back out. The tide would rise, and sure enough, the tide would not. And he said this to me. I said, okay, explain. He said, in that moment, I thought, as hard as life is right now, that tide will go back out. There is another day. Here's a song that we sing in a passage. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. You remember what it says next? Say it again. His mercies never end. They are new every morning. Hardships are intense. They get our attention. There's some benefit, even though we don't want to hear it at the time. Sometimes we think all hope is lost. There's nothing we can do to overcome this. But God is merciful. And He gives us just enough mercy every day to last that day. You remember the manna story, right? He didn't give them enough manna for years or weeks or months. He gave them enough manna for one day. And that's all they needed. And the reason they only had enough manna for one day was to let them wake up every day and realize their dependence on God. I may not have enough mercy to get through all of the chemo treatment. I may not have enough endurance. I may not have enough in me to get past years of heartbreak of losing a loved one, but God will give me what I need today. And then when I wake up, that mercy is renewed. And then when I wake up again, that mercy is renewed. People need comfort in the midst of their hardships, but sadly, some people will use the emotional experience of hardships to try to attack the existence of God. I would ask you to think deeper about that. Hope the lesson has been somewhat beneficial. I understand that I didn't answer every question. I understand it's a difficult subject, but I hope it has at least got the wheels turning for us to process these things. As we close, are there any final thoughts or comments you'd like to make? Go ahead, brother. Yes.
A lot of times it's not so much for us that's going through the suffering as it is for someone who's around us.
Exactly. It's tough, yeah. It's so hard to be the person who watches someone suffer and that person you love more than your own self, and to watch them suffer. That might be the hardest. You're right. Anything else? Thank you for your kind attention. I believe we start a study on Genesis next week, is that correct? And we'll have a booklet, and see Eddie for more information if you have questions about that booklet. All right, thank you.